Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also check us out on Apple, Google, and Spotify. And recently I've been doing a lot of guest appearances on podcasts, most recently on the Close Watch podcast where I discussed Alex Perez's The Crow. You can check that out. And so I do have at least one or two other podcasts that I'm going to be doing in the future, so I'm looking forward to that. But Sonic Cinema Podcast is obviously on Sonic Cinema as well as YouTube and other streaming platforms. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you will find deep dives into specific topics like Daniel Craig's run on James Bond or horror movies or the Lonesome Dove series and a bunch of other stuff. That's patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. And I also do some live streaming on Twitch at twitch.tv/ScuttleLemur. It's been a bit irregular with my work schedule, but hopefully I'll be getting some regularity there. And that is at twitch.tv/ScuttleLemur. Normally, when I have a filmmaker on the podcast, it's usually to discuss it's usually been to discuss their newest work, or after we've had that initial discussion, we'll bring them in to discuss other films that they like, film genres that they prefer, filmmakers that they prefer, and that's certainly been the case with today's guest. He's been on the podcast several times over the years, and we've talked about everything from his work to working in the movie theater to Godzilla, Gamera, and Jess Franco. And we're actually going to be discussing his filmmaking work, in particular 3 short films that he just posted online that you'll be able to find on YouTube. And I'd like to welcome back to the podcast Matthew Saliba. Thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Brian. I must say this kind of feels a little surreal to me because for the longest time, it seems, I've made a name for myself talking about and promoting other people's work. That's somewhere along the line, I forgot that once upon a time I was a filmmaker too. So it's going to be fun to go down memory lane.
Well, and it's good because of the fact that this is, I mean, I had you on Twitch earlier this year and we talked about Godzilla versus Kong. But your last time on the podcast, we talked about Jess Franco, and I'm actually very glad we had that discussion and I had that introduction to Franco's work before watching these. These were all earlier films from the film that I was introduced to you from, Eroticide. And you recently unearthed some prints of them and posted them on YouTube. And I'd like for you to sort of take it from there, sort of like how that process came about, and just, I mean, obviously the impulse to put them online was certainly to have get people an opportunity to watch these movies that had kind of been lost for a while. But if you could go through the process of sort of what was like getting these titles back and being able to post them online.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I don't know if I ever mentioned this on the show. I certainly mentioned it on my social media, but I'm actually bipolar type 2. And to give you sort of a thumbnail on what that is, I basically go through pretty violent mood swings. I'm on medication now, and that's certainly leveled me out. But a few years ago, when I had lost my job at the Carlton, I went through a very, very serious depression to the point where I even tried to take my life on 2 occasions. But as this pertains to my films, there was one night where I went through a really, really bad attack, and in that sort of frantic state, I actually took all the negatives to my films, and I literally threw them in a garbage can and set that on fire, because at that point I was so sure that I wasn't going to be on this earth anymore, that I just wanted to completely eliminate and eradicate any trace that I ever existed. And I did the one thing that, I never thought I would have ever done when I had initially made these films. And so, yeah, I mean, they were lost for the longest time. And by that, just to put things in perspective, like, I'm not talking about, I don't even have the DVD copies of my movies. All those files were destroyed. And then when I moved back to Montreal, and I got to see my family doctor again, and I got to see a psychiatrist. And at that point, I started, I guess, in a way, sort of rebuilding confidence in myself, and sort of realizing the huge mistake that I made in destroying my masters. So I reached out to a gentleman by the name of S.V. Bell. He is sort of like Quebec's answer to Roger Corman, in the sense that he's a filmmaker himself. Although lately he's sort of transitioned to being a painter, and it's beautiful. His paintings are wonderful. And anyway, I reached out to S.V. Bell because whenever I would finish making a film, I would create a DVD with commentary and extras and pass these along to the cast and crew. And S.V. Bell was the one who basically built those DVDs. And so I remembered that when I reached out to him, and I basically, it's thanks to S.V. Bell that my films are in circulation again, because he happened to have a few of the digital masters that he needed to make my DVDs. He didn't have every single one of my films, but I mean, he sort of had the Mount Rushmore, as I like to call it. So I figured, like, he saved the good ones. And yeah, I mean, he sent me the files, and I do have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Matthew Saliba. And yeah, basically I put them up on there. And yeah, I mean, that was basically the journey to get these films up online. And I can't thank S.V. Bell enough because he really, he basically saved my legacy.
Well, thank you very much for your honesty. I know talking about such personal matters, especially when it comes to mental health, can be very difficult. And I'm somebody who's dealt with anxiety, stress management issues, and depression over the years. And it's certainly a especially when you first start that process, it can be very, very scary to talk about it. I mean, I talk about it very easily now because I'm many years into that process of trying to control that anxiety. I mean, certainly because of certain life situations that can get flared up, and it's tough to maintain those emotions. But I'm certainly grateful that we have the opportunity to talk about these movies, and that I've had the opportunity to see these movies. And it's funny because as I was going through these in preparation for this episode, after I got done watching all four of them, I went back and listened to basically the first half of our initial discussion where we were talking about eroticide. And one of the things I told you yesterday, I believe, was how it was interesting because I didn't necessarily remember all the specifics about, and we didn't necessarily, the films weren't necessarily named in that initial interview, but at the same time, listening to you talk about them in that context, and then putting that together with how I felt about them, watching them, and what the notes that I wrote down, it's like, oh yeah, this makes all the sense in the world. And it's like, oh yeah, I very much felt that I very much felt that influence in each of these films. And I think the thing that is, I always think it's interesting to see filmmakers build a body of work that is not only intentionally personal, but also something that has an overarching idea into it. And and we can certainly discuss each one in depth. And but it's like one of the interesting things that I found about these movies is that it did feel like there's overarching ideas that are in place each and every time, and it's very much something personal. And we certainly talked about the personal aspect of eroticide in that initial conversation. And I even watching it again, I believe it was Monday I watched it again, and it was just lovely. It continues to be my favorite of your films. I think it's, and there are certainly things that I really like about the other three, but there's something about Eroticide that I think is so nakedly painful. And then on top of that, you have the craft that you can tell that the craft has grown over the course of these films. Even though it's still pretty good the first time out, you can definitely see the maturation process in all four of these films, culminating in Eroticide. And so I always appreciate when a filmmaker. I'm always grateful when a filmmaker gives me a chance to watch their films, and it's something that I take very seriously, the process of watching their films, especially if it's the filmmaker itself, as opposed to like PR people and stuff like that. I think that gives it much more importance to me to take this process seriously of thinking about these movies.
Gosh, wow. Well, I mean, thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, I imagine we will get into them one by one. But it was funny because I don't really make a habit of watching my films. I mean, I definitely, when I started out, I went through that phase where I would grab random people and put them in a room and make them watch them. I mean, just to give you some perspective, that my very first film, The Manipulator and the Subservient, I remember when my mom had some of her church friends over, I brought them into my room to watch the movie, and so I definitely went through that phase. But now it's more of a I mean, I don't really, yeah, I mean, it's not something I'll go out of my way to watch, but I did watch them last night in order too, because I've always felt that the best way to, if you can, to discover a filmmaker is to try to watch their films in order, because you could sort of see the journey. And it was, I don't know. I mean, it was really interesting watching them. I mean, I don't know who I spoke to about this, but I feel like, like unless someone is completely delusional, I don't think a filmmaker truly enjoys their films the same way like someone like, let's say, like you, like as someone would watch them. Like, because when I watch them, I certainly see, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, all the behind the scenes stories that went on. And but on the whole, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised, at how in some cases, like how quickly the time flew, and in many respects, how while there are certain similarities, I mean, how they're all kind of different in their own way.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you almost like took the name of the director off the film, you'd be almost hard pressed to find that they were directed by the same person. Just because, like, when I was going in order, and especially when you make the jump from Amy's in the Attic to Eroticide, like clearly something went on in those intervening years. But I mean, I'm happy to talk about Eroticide again. But I mean, this is your show. I'll let you steer the ship. But yeah. Go on.
When we talked plenty about Eroticide that first time, I mean, I think the main reason I would I think the main reason I would want to bring up a raw side is simply within the context of these previous films. I mean, listening back to that initial interview, we talked plenty about raw side, and I would encourage anybody listening who has not heard that earlier interview, or maybe hasn't heard it in a while, to check it out. Is episode 36, I believe, of the Sonic Cinema podcast, and it was from 2018. And we spent a good amount of time on a raw side there. And it's how long had it been before last night that you'd watched these films?
Oh gosh. Well, okay, you're talking about like the earlier ones?
Yeah, the earlier ones.
I mean, the early. I want to say probably maybe like 2011, so maybe a good 10 years.
Oh wow.
I mean, at least for the older ones, like I know Eroticide, the last time I had watched that was in 2015 or somewhere on that part. But for the older films, yeah, certainly they've been older than that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I certainly understand that the fact that filmmakers certainly look at their films. If they do look back on them, they certainly look through different eyes because of the fact that you're also thinking about the process of the making of them more than the viewer is and the audience is. And I think I certainly think that's one of the more interesting things of talking to filmmakers about their work, especially if it's something they did earlier in their career, earlier in their life, and sort of reflecting on how they look at that now. And is there anything, and we'll talk about specifics in the context of the short films. Is there anything that you look at these films now compared to when you first made them, and do you feel differently about them compared to how you initially felt?
Well, if there was one thing that I took away from watching all these movies back to back, because again, like these were, well, with the exception of Eroticide, but the earlier films, I mean, these were sort of made at a time before YouTube really exploded, and before the internet became, the archive where nothing ever dies. In retrospect, had I known how big the internet would get, I would have maybe gone back and directed them under a pseudonym. Not that there's ever been any problems, as far as jobs or opportunities like that go, but I can't help but feel like no, I do have something I could tell you because I was thinking about this. I've never really spoken about this publicly, but one of my passions outside of film and art is politics. And one of my, fantasies has always been to run for office here in Canada. However, the running joke about that would be as soon as I would announce my candidacy, all someone would have to do is look up one of these films or just do a Google search on me. And within same day, within the same day, I would have to withdraw my candidacy.
It would basically be like a Simpsons moment. I mean, it really, yeah. I mean, that's, we can, and the fact is, it's like we can, and that's actually interesting. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard that you mention that before, but yeah, I mean, and the thing is, it's like that sort of goes to just, I feel like, it's not necessarily, obviously it's not just a Canadian thing. We see it in the States all the time, although it seems to matter less and less now. But no, the fact is, it's like there's so much, there's so much, in that you look at in the past, and it's like certainly, you think about in your past, and it's like, oh well, that would completely tank me. But it's like, it also goes to something where it's like, I mean, really, that's, why are we judging people in things they did like 10 years ago? And it's like, it's especially
Well,
when
I
it
mean,
comes to art, especially when it comes to art. And I mean, it's like,
well, perhaps like now that you've seen my films, and I mean, there are certain things, and I know we're going to talk about them, but there are certain things where, wait, what was I saying? Oh, no, what was it? Oh, geez. Um, yeah, I mean, like, so you've seen my film, so maybe you could understand why I'm a little more sensitive to the whole idea of cancel culture and canceling
yeah,
people who have
yeah,
said. Now, of course, if people have said or done horrible things and they're still acting in that way, obviously, I have no problem with,
hmm,
taking them down. But I mean, certainly in my case, I mean, I guess if you're asking me, would I still make the same films today? Probably not, and that's probably because I'm a very different person. Like
yeah,
back then, I mean, I was in my 20s. I honestly thought that I was going to be dead at 27
mm,
because I lived hard and played hard. When we would, we would shoot, and then whenever we would wrap, we'd always go out for a big party, and naturally I would be the one consuming the most alcohol and substances. And
hmm,
so I think, certainly when I was younger, I had this feeling that, I'm never going to be 39. I'm never going to get married. I'm never going
yeah,
to, I'm going to be. So you don't think of these things. And I mean, in all fairness, I'm very proud of my work.
yeah,
And I mean, I certainly have nothing to really apologize for. I mean, I think, is it provocative? Of course it's provocative. But I mean, I think
hmm,
whenever you're going to make films that combine sex and drama and horror, I mean, I think by that very nature, it's meant to be provocative.
yeah,
But I mean, I think you have to take a look at what people do in their day-to-day lives and how they conduct themselves. And I don't necessarily think that what a person has created is indicative of who that person is in real
hmm,
life. Because by that logic, I mean, Schwarzenegger should be behind bars for all the people he shot in action films. You know what I mean? So it's
yeah,
like, so yeah. I mean, and then I guess from a technical standpoint, I mean, I could point out these things, but at the same time, I don't want to disrupt the magic of someone who watches this film and they genuinely enjoy it. And I don't want to poke too many holes there. I don't
yeah,
want to point out
yeah.
all the things that they probably shouldn't be looking for. Um, but I will say this though, and when I did my premiere of Eroticide, I actually showed my first film um, before it because I thought it was very telling because in many respects those two films kind of tell a similar story,
Hmm,
but I was at a very different point in my life in 2003 than I was in 2013. In 2003, I mean, like I think the average length of one of my appearances on your podcast is like an hour and 15 minutes. Uh, Back in 2003, you'd be hard pressed to get 1 minute and 15 seconds of copy out of my mouth.
yeah,
So, whereas in 2013, I was a lot more comfortable with who I was, and I was more than willing to talk about some of these things.
hmm,
And I think you sort of see that in the film. Like, I mean, certainly in comparison to Eroticide, my first film is very surreal and experimental and esoteric.
yeah,
Whereas, Eroticide just sort of cuts through all the actually, that's maybe something I would do. When I look at some of my films, I feel like I would maybe cut through the bull spit
hmm,
and just maybe tell the story that needs to be told. Because I mean, Eroticide could have been done a very different way. Had I made Eroticide back in 2003, I feel it would probably be akin more to like a Lynchian nightmare than the Michael Haneke sort of inspired drama that it became.
hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I would certainly say, I mean, I think, I mean, I certainly think that there is, I think all of these films are, I think all of these films are good. I think all of these films represent a strong vision. Even if I prefer some of them over others, I mean, I still recognize that there's a definite vision to all of them. So I mean, I definitely appreciate the creative aspect of it, and it's interesting that you looked at, you sort of compared the manipulator and the subservient, the first film in 2003 to Eroticide, because in thinking about in that context, that actually does kind of make a lot of sense in that one is very much looking at the sort of relationship, the dominant and sub relationship from an almost fantastical standpoint in the first film, and then the later film is very much in the perspective of we're just going to cut through the bullshit, get to the emotion. And I think, and the thing is, it's like, I think both of them achieve their emotional impacts in their own unique way. And let's go and start to discuss these, and we'll go ahead and start with 2003's The Manipulator and the Subservient, if you wouldn't mind setting the stage for us.
Sure. Well, I could tell you the story of how that kind of came to be. That was, although actually before that, I just wanted to say one quick thing, because for the longest time, I always used to tell people that I started my film career in 2003. But in reality, the very, very, very first film project I ever worked on was in my first year film class in 2001. And the reason why I mentioned that is because the film was directed by Pavel Pogorelsky, who happens to be the DOP for films on Hereditary and Midsummer.
Oh, okay, yeah.
No, like I mean, it sounds like such a cliche, but when you look back, I mean, you could see who's clearly destined for success when you go to school and that, and like he always had a good head on. And anyway, so like we made a film together, and it was funny because in many respects it was very much the typical first year film student film. It was shot in black and white. I played a priest, and there was a Pink Floyd soundtrack. So it was pretty much, we hit all those checkpoints. And I just bring that up because I'm really proud of Pavel. Like when I saw his name, I was like, oh, wow. Because because he was a big Tarkovsky fan too, like you. And so I really recognized that in his cinematography. So anyway, that was the first year film class. And the way that worked in film school is that you were basically put in groups of 3 or 4, and you guys had to collaborate together. In film 2, our second class, that changed to the point where pretty much everyone got to direct their own short film. So in many respects, this was actually a student film. And but the thing is, at that point, this is when I sort of knew I wanted to do this for a living. So I took a bit of a proactive step, and when I had finished the film, I wasn't too much concerned about the year-end screening that they would do. I was already thinking about film festivals, and I had reached out to the Fantasia Film Festival here in Montreal, and I wasn't sure if they accepted student films, so I just told them, like, I have this project. It's kind of a cross between Eraserhead and Suspiria, and so they kind of liked that, and then of course they ended up accepting the film. So no, I just bring that up because it was made at Concordia University, but I don't consider it a student film in the sense that I did actively push that for festivals. And then, yeah, I mean, as far as the film goes, I had to actually like go back because I have notes and stuff, and because I mean it's been such a long time. I mean it's 2000. So I mean I think the script was written in the winter of 2002, and then I think the way it worked was that once the script was written, we showed that to our professor who signed off on it, and then in January, February of the next year, we shot the actual film. And so basically, I mean, as far as the casting goes, I reached out to a school here in Montreal called the Montreal School of Performing Arts. So all of the actors in the film, with the exception of myself and Mark Evan, who played the cowboy, Yeah, they all came from that school, and it was a really interesting experience because they were fully trained actors, and prior to that point, I had only really dealt with people like myself who
Mhm.
who are more performers than actors, and it was we shot this on 16 millimeter, so that's sort of why the film kind of has a bit of a softer look because this was way before digital, and it was a pretty exhilarating experience. I mean, this was really like my first time directing my own film. And, to see my vision come to life was really something special. I do remember at the time, being somewhat reluctant to discuss some of the specifics in terms of what the film was meant to be, because I was kind of going through my David Lynch phase at the time, and and that's something that's different because as a director now, I mean, I would never not tell my actors what the material is supposed to be because I mean that's how you sort of get the best performances. And that's something else I kind of noticed with the film too. I mean, like there's good performances, but I see stuff that, if 2021 Matthew was directing this film, I'd probably redirect a few of the few scenes here and there.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, I guess the question you're really asking is like, what's the film all about? And that, um, one of the reasons why I compared this to Eroticide was because, much like Eroticide, this was about a woman who destroyed me, and it seems like every 10 years that happens. So we're coming up on 2023, so I'm kind of due now. And so this was basically it was based on there was a girl that I cared for at the time, but it was unrequited, and so I decided to make a movie about that, and essentially about an experience where in the beginning, you sort of see the situation where there's this young man who's attracted to this woman, but she's in a relationship with this other guy, and then where things get a little different is where the concept of the psychogenic feud comes into play. So I'm really I love films like Lost Highway and Carnival of Souls and Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Jacob's
Mhm.
Ladder. Films that play with that rubber reality where you're not sure what's real and what's fantasy. So
Yeah.
in this case, basically the whole concept is that the young man is obviously traumatized by this situation, so he retreats into his own mind, where in his world, he's in control of things. He literally grows the woman that he loves in his bathtub, and she's very sort of subservient to him. However, much like any psychogenic fugue, eventually reality does creep in bit by bit. So in this case, when the mailman comes over with that big box, and the old man opens it and sees the collar and leash, that's supposed to symbolize the fact that even in dreams he can't really be with the woman he loves, which is sort of how I felt at the
Mhm.
time. So I don't know if any of that works for you. I mean, it's been a really long time, but I mean, I think that was by and large what I remember of it.
No, it's funny because of the fact that Lost Highway was exact. When I wrote down my notes for this film, Lost Highway was exactly the Lynch film that came to mind when it comes to. But I mean, you can also see influences. You can also see like Mulholland Drive in this, maybe even a little bit of Inland Empire, even though obviously Inland Empire was a few years later. And then yes, Eraserhead, of course.
Well,
Um,
that's the thing because you were asking earlier, like what I was thinking of when I was watching these films, and one of the things I noticed is you can clearly see when I've discovered a new director, which is I think that's probably the most glaring thing to me is like you can clearly see. And it's funny you mentioned Mulholland Drive because I think that came out in 2001, so I think that was my first David Lynch film.
mhm.
And so obviously, I mean, I became really enamored with him, and yeah, I mean, like I mean, the film did well, like on festivals and such. Like going back to Fantasia, like they had a special short film competition where it was nominated for best director, editing, cinematography, and screenplay. And then, like, I had submitted to some other festivals. There was a festival in Minnesota called the Bearded Child Film Festival, and that film actually won Best of Fest, and I got $100 check in the mail.
Oh wow. Yeah.
So no, it did pretty well. I think in spite of the fact that it might be a little hard to get into or to read on first glance, it does seem that people kind of it certainly
Mm.
resonated with people. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I forgot the big thing about this movie that I was supposed to talk about. Yes, so oh God, whoa, Jesus. All right, maybe we can edit that out. But anyway, um, yes, so for me, I'm not. I know this is going to sound like tooting my own horn, but I've always sort of seen myself as a little ahead of my time in the sense that, like, when YouTube started to come into its own, like I always sort of saw that as a cloud. Like I never actively promoted that channel. So like in the beginning, when I made The Manipulator and The Subservient, I took the opening scene and just put it on my YouTube channel, like as a little teaser.
Yeah.
And that clip um, be, was essentially my first viral clip because that took on a life of its own. uh, I mean, you wouldn't know it now because I had to basically delete hundreds of comments, but I would get all kinds of comments, like people not really realizing that this is a movie, that they think that this is just something I filmed in my living room. and so and so it got to the point where people were writing pretty awful stuff
Yeah.
particularly about the actress Lila Marcelino. And so it
Mm.
got to the point where it's like, at one point I just shut off comments altogether just because it was getting too gratuitous. But I've recently put them back on and I just filter them. But yeah, I mean, that was a clip that kind of took on a life of its own, to the point where actually a few months ago, before I ever got in touch with SV Bell about my master's, someone had actually posted that opening clip, and they put a bounty of $100 on my film for anyone who could basically find. Like, you can look this up on Google. Like, someone put on a Reddit, someone put like $100 bounty on my film, and I don't know. Do I get to claim that since I found it? I don't know.
I mean, I would certainly hope so, but no, I will say it's like I think there's a strong sense of visual storytelling. I think your visual sense as a storyteller is very confident from minute one. And I mean, with this type of story, it would almost have to be because of the fact that you're pulling from influences like Lynch, and if his vision doesn't work, the entire thing collapses. And I think that is, I think especially if you're going to do your version of an auteur as distinctive as Lynch, I mean, you definitely need to be confident in that. And I think that, combined with the story, I mean, this is I there's such a quiet sadness to this movie. It's not quite as viscerally sad as A Raw Side becomes, but there's just a quiet sadness because, like you said, this is essentially about somebody who's longing for a relationship that they're just not capable, they're not into, and it's one, or they're not going to have. And it's like you said, the more that they go into that fugue state and the more they go into that imaginary relationship, the more the reality creeps into it. And yeah, that is one of the strongest aspects of it. The control between fantasy and reality. And I think that it's extremely effective in the end in there.
Well, I mean, again, thank you very much. I'm not used to getting nice comments, but no, I mean, yeah. Again, I mean, Lynch was very. I mean, one thing I could definitely say though, like watching this, is that I do feel like I do feel like it might be a little too enamored with Lynch, to the point where, because I know like the follow-up film I made to this was a film called Pandora's Paradox, which was about an old woman who gives birth to a giant toe, and when the toe is fed milk, it hatches into a little boy, and basically the boy has to live with his mother and father in this dysfunctional relationship. and essentially at the end he basically returns home to his mother's womb. And I mean, definitely, I consider that and this film to be my little Lynchian duo, because that's clearly when, I mean, I was starting to build my own voice, but I still feel like at this stage in my career, I was still relying very much on my influences, as opposed to, you know, like maybe, like as opposed to, let's say, Eroticide, where the influences aren't as apparent as, let's say, you know, my first film.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, it's interesting that it's like this is the personal aspect of this is sort of from an unrequited love. I mean, I've certainly had instances where I've had those type of you know, inner relationships with people that never really, you know, came to fruition. And you know, it's really, you know, I know it can be really difficult to have that realization. And I was, you know, I was just kind of curious. And one of the things that I think is very, you know, and hearing you talk about it in that respect makes me not quite as sure about my own personal thoughts in terms of the connective tissue of all four of these, because of the fact that, I mean, you know, the way you portray your character and then Leela's character is very much a dominant submissive relationship in the vein of like a BDSM type relationship. And that's where sort of the comparison to Eroticide really makes a lot of sense for me, because you sort of see that same type of relationship play out, but you've seen it after it already curdled into something completely toxic. And Yan in that movie realized and tried to get away from it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, well, one thing, when I was watching this movie, I actually found myself longing for the days when this was my worst problem. But I do have a little post note to the film, because a couple years later, I received an email from the woman who the film was based on, and because she had heard about my film, and we had gotten so we got in touch with each other, and we actually sat down and watched it side by side. And I'll never forget, I think her first response when the film was done was, "Oh, I never led you on," as if, you know, from the opening scene where I'm on the leash. Mm-hmm. So I think she took that a little literally. But yeah. But anyway, that's just a little post note. Yeah, I mean, like, you know, I mean, I'll definitely talk about it more with the next film that we're going to bring up, because, but yeah, I mean, like, I've made no point to hide the fact that, you know, especially at that point, I was very much involved in the fetish community. And so, you know, for me, like, when I think of, you know, or at the time, at least, when I thought of sex, like, you know, fetish was sex. And so in many respects, that's why fetish imagery has been so prominent in a lot of my films, because that's what I know. I mean, I suppose, because, I mean, like, sometimes, like, some people in the fetish community would criticize these films for certain negative portrayals. Of course, the fetish community is also incredibly toxic, so there's some irony in them complaining about negative portrayals. But no, and I tell them, you know, by choosing fetish imagery, I'm not necessarily making a statement on that, although I was a little bit with Eroticide. I mean, it's just because that's what I know. I mean, if I were gay, I mean, my films would be filled with homosexual imagery. And then, of course, people would then say, well, what are you saying about gay people? It's like, well, no, because I'm gay, so I'm writing about that material. You know, you write what you know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so I've never seen my films as intentionally trying to portray BDSM in a negative light. But I mean, perhaps because I think maybe people are more responding to perhaps the sadness of the story, and not so much the imagery, the S&M imagery.
Yeah, and I think I think that's kind of where in terms of using that imagery as sort of symbolism as to how how your character feels compared to, you know, the woman he's fantasizing about having this life with. It's interesting to it makes sense to sort of have that symbolic idea of that representational idea of that relationship, or that sort of manifesting into sort of that type of relationship that, you know, it. I think I'm trying to explain this better, but you know, it's but I think having that sort of having that imagery sort of representative of that type of relationship, I think does feel very natural in this film, and I think I think in the context of this particular film, I think it's an effective way of getting to the emotions that the main character is feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm back then. I used a term to sort of define my style of film, and I used to call it sadoerotic, which was basically the erotic representation of sadomasochistic imagery as opposed to the pornographic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because, like, I've always found it odd that, people in the fetish community would sometimes turn on my work, particularly when my films would play at festivals where they would sometimes show like flat out pornographic fetish material. And like, so no, I mean, like, by choosing this stuff, I mean, like, I'm just writing what I know.
Oh yeah.
I'm certainly not intentionally, at least, trying to make anyone look bad.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a little funny story about the title of the film. So I don't know if when you Googled the title, if I always feel sorry for anyone who Googles this film or Googles this specific title, because when you Google it, a certain video game pops up called Final Fantasy Tactics.
Oh wow.
and because like the game is sort of divided into chapters, and one of the chapters is called The Manipulator and the Subservient, so that's sort of where that comes from. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, it's just funny because, you know, if you Google that, or for that matter, if Final Fantasy fans are Googling The Manipulator and the Subservient, I'm very curious to see their response.
So we'll go ahead and move on to the next film, and this is obviously really where I'm grateful that we had that discussion about Jess Franco, and that I'm now more familiar with Jess Franco, and in particular his most famous film, Vampiros Lesbos, because this next film is a little remake. In a way of, although I wouldn't say it's a remake, it's more of it starts out sort of as a remake and then basically kind of goes on its own axis, and I think that's one of the things that's most impressive of this. I think I think overall it's an extremely strong vision, and it's actually I think to a certain extent it's a very inspired update on a cult classic like this film. What first of all, I want to talk about I would like to ask you about the style, because it's not just Franco that you're drawing from, but I feel like there's another very famous film from it's from the 60s that you're drawing from as well, in the way that you made this movie.
Yes, I was waiting for you to ask about that, because yes, that's the first thing everyone. Well, I mean, no, actually, the first thing I would always hear from people would be like, "F you for remaking a classic." The second thing I would hear would be, "What's with the stills?" Yes, I mean, the film, yeah, you're referring to Chris Marker's La Jetée, which inspired 12 Monkeys. Mm-hmm. So for this, we'll have to go back a couple years, and forgive me for going off on these tangents. It's been a very long time, and I'm trying to recollect the steps that led to this. But so back in 2006, I had written a script called "Raped Three Ways." And it was basically a subversive rape and revenge film where instead of let's say two or three guys raping a woman, it was two women raping a guy. And as you could probably imagine, in 2006, it was very difficult to shop this around to people. And so at some point, I sort of gave up on the idea of ever turning that into a movie. Until I met a photographer in 2007 by the name of Mario Carangi. I was put in touch with them because I had an idea to do a photo shoot. And when I went to his website, he said he had written something that I thought was really, really interesting because I had never heard a photographer talk about photography this way. He said he was looking to collaborate with people who want to tell stories through pictures. Now, I mean, there's obviously themed photo shoots people do, but I mean, usually it's just like a handful of pictures. But I had never heard him describe it in that way before. So I basically told him about my Raped Three Ways idea. And, he loved it. We cast it. And basically, again, it was initially conceived as a photo shoot. So, we had stills that were in panoramic, but then also in portrait mode. And so basically, once the photo shoot was done, I took the pictures and I made like a little slideshow, really, to music, and I called it "She Was Asking for It." And it took on a life of its own because Fantasia heard about this and they showed the film. They showed it, I think, before a film called Silent Screams, which was another S&M themed film. So I guess they got good programming there. And then after that, like basically what happens with film festivals, especially with Fantasia, is like if you get in at Fantasia, everyone else starts basically writing you to get a copy of the film and see if it's right for their festival. Mm-hmm. And so She Was Asking for It ended up playing at a bunch of film festivals and even won one. I think it won the People's Choice Award at the Wreck Beach Film Festival in Ontario. And so based on the success of that, we decided to make another one, but with the idea that this was going to be a film. So no more portraits, like everything was going to be shot in panoramic. And, so we cast the film. The film was cast with a lot of really interesting people. There was Isabel Stephen, who played my wife, Linda. I cannot say enough wonderful things about her, and I'm not sure when this is going to drop, but by then people will probably have found out that she's going to produce my new film. So we're going to be collaborating again. So I cast her. Kitty Daly was another model, and there was Caden Rose and Denis Coupeau, who played the priest. And then, as far as the stills go, there were a lot of advantages to making a film like this because I live in Montreal, and Montreal is in the province of Quebec, and Quebec is primarily French-speaking. And one of my biggest pet peeves about horror films in Quebec is that many people will make films with the idea of trying to sell them to the States. But the problem is that everyone who speaks in these films, instead of sounding like they're from Chicago, they sound like they're from Chicoutimi. And so that I hated that. But then in Eroticide, I found a way to work around that. But so in the case of like Vampiros Lesbos, because this was all still photography, I could work with anyone I want to work with, whether or not they have experience, whether or not they because it's all very crafted and it's all posing and everything, and it was a really interesting way to make a film because like sometimes in the case of where there was action, like for example like the scene in the bedroom when Isabel's riding me into the bedroom, we like in real life, like we called lights, camera, and then action, and we would like act out the movements, and like Mario would be there firing with the photography. And so that's why, like, you can kind of see, like, in some cases, like, where it almost feels like it's fluid motion.
Hmm.
Now, I mean, I would end up making another movie with Mario after this called Dark Lotus, which is unfortunately lost. But that was sort of the last part of this sort of stills trilogy, and that took the move. That took our style in a whole new direction because this was in black and white, and there was even more care to try to recreate the illusion of motion. But I'm glad you did see Vampiros Lesbos, because it's really like, it's not the best, but it's not the worst either. It's right in the middle in the sense of how the style was developing.
Yeah, I definitely yeah, I mean you definitely you get the feel of a narrative music video in this film, and I you do definitely notice the fluidity of motion, even as you recognize that it's still photography. And I think the fact that it is still photography is what makes this so effective in not just in being as much more of an homage to Franco than trying to simply imitate him, trying to do something on your own that goes in a very different direction than what Franco did, but also paying respect to what you were getting out of the filmmaker as an inspiration for this particular film.
And that kind of goes back to what we were talking earlier with my first film, how like that might have felt too Lynchian for its own good. Whereas in this case, like you could clearly see that, while I am drawing from Franco, it's not to the same extent that, let's say, I was drawing from Lynch with my first film. Like, this is very much like my own thing. Now, I mean, I know we spoke about this on the Jess Franco podcast, but I'll just recap real quick because this will go into why I decided to pay homage. And I'm glad you said it's not a remake, because I was always very clear. I was always very careful not to say remake. I always use words like homage and such. This was actually before people used words like reboot and stuff.
Yeah.
But so no, I was, but because yeah, I mean. I always sort of looked at this as sort of a Cliff's Notes version of Vampiros Lesbos. For, if you didn't quite get the point of the feature, hopefully the short kind of makes it abundantly clear. So, I mean, basically, like I said on the Just Franco podcast, and I want to make this clear that this is just my interpretation, because Just Franco doesn't strike me as being a misogynist. I mean, I know he and his wife Lena Romay were together for such a long time, but anyway, so I mean, but again, like when you create a work of art, there's your intention and there's what people are going to read into it, and especially if your film takes off, I mean, it goes on a life of its own, and sometimes you can't control how people are going to interpret your stuff. But anyway, I always sort of saw Vampiros Lesbos and that whole lesbian vampire subgenre as kind of homophobic. In the sense that these stories are almost always about a woman in a very dry, dull, sterile, vanilla relationship with her husband. They go out to a club. She gets seduced by a female vampire. She goes to live with the female vampire, and then at some point the husband has to go and rescue her to save her, heaven forbid, from her lesbian relationship and bring her back to the world of heteronormalcy. And so what I wanted to do, so I really kind of seized on that because, and again, maybe I spoke about this before, but, it was around this time that I sort of came out of the kink closet and, I mean, because people would see this in my films that, they would always ask me, well, how come you're always doing this kind of stuff? You don't actually like this, do you? And I always used to pretend that I didn't. I would be like, well, no, this is just for my movie. But then at some point I sort of did come out. And unfortunately, while there were people who did support me and still support me to this day, I lost a lot of family and friends. And that really hurt me a lot. And I think that in many respects caused me to get very militant about my views, which is why I'm somewhat sympathetic to people in the LGBTQ community who come out and they get a little militant about their views, because, you know, when you're putting up with so much bullshit from people, I mean, you can't help but lash out.
Mhm.
Of course, maybe looking back on it, I maybe could have endeared myself a little better, because I shouldn't necessarily assume that everyone is gonna, you know, cast judgment on me. But anyway, I was young, and you know, but at any rate, it did result in this movie, so I guess there's some good that came out of that. And so anyway, so what I wanted to do was basically transfer my story to that of Linda's. So in this case, you know, Linda, we see at the beginning that she's, you know, in this relationship with Omar, and clearly it's not really going very well. One night they go out to this club, and she's enticed by the Countess Nadine. And you know, through her experience with Nadine, like basically she discovers that she's really into S&M, and so, which is why she and Countess Nadine take their frustrations out on Omar's character. But then, you know, Omar escapes, and like in any true lesbian vampire film, he seeks the cloth, and you know, he goes back to try and quote unquote save her, much like how some people tried to save me with when I sort of came out like that. So that was sort of my that was the reason why I wanted to sort of pay homage to Vampiros Lesbos, just because that was something that really stuck with me, I should say. And you know, I'll admit, you know, I always used to champion genre film as the ideal medium for someone who wants to make a film about political and social stuff but doesn't want to be obvious about it. But the problem is, you know, my films play in all kinds of countries, and unfortunately, they never have the budget to fly me in. So I can't attend all these screenings and have this conversation where I explain what
Mhm.
Vampiros Lesbos is supposed to be. So unfortunately, you know, some people, people may have gotten that like after I told them, but certainly on first or second or maybe even third viewings, I don't think that's anything. I'm not sure that's something that really, and so that's, you know, you could sort of see like how, you know, like around this point, I learned a pretty valuable lesson, and I think in many respects that influenced me to sort of change my style up as the years would go on.
Yeah, and it's when you did when you did post production on this, did you were some of the photographic effects, were some of the visual effects, or some of in by which I mean some of the ways that the images look on screen, is that something that you guys worked out in the initial shooting of the photos, or was it something that when you put these together in the sequence of making the film, was this something that you worked out in post in terms of getting some of the different visual effects going in?
Oh, well, honestly, with the exception of the fact that this was done with stills, this was very much treated like a regular film. Like there was a script, there was a shot list, there was a storyboard. Obviously, with Mario being the director of photography, he had some leniency in terms of how he wanted to frame shots. But no, everything was worked out ahead of time. Like we shot at his studio, we built sets and everything. There were a couple of visual effects done in post. I think the scene where when the girls are biting me on either side of my neck, and like the screen blacks out and you just see my eyes. That was something we did in post.
Mm-hmm.
But no, again, Mario and I were very. Like, he was one of my favorite people to collaborate with. We were very much in sync. And I do have a fun story about him. I don't know if he wants me to tell this, but when I first met him, it was at a coffee shop, and based on his style of photography, I was expecting like a young person, but imagine my surprise when this sort of grandfatherly type, this really boisterous, really nice guy showed up, and so never judge a book by its cover, I guess.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, all of these are now available on your YouTube channel, and I highly recommend, especially if you were a fan for Raw's Side, and that's all that you've known of Matthew's work, based on our conversations over the years, and I would definitely recommend checking these films out. I think they make an interesting body of work, and they certainly make an interesting an interesting evolution of Matthew as a filmmaker. And I would certainly, you know, and it's interesting because of the fact that your third film that has surfaced recently is one where I'll admit I don't know that it's quite as effective as your other films in these three, but it certainly maintains a strong vision, and I'm definitely looking forward to getting into talking about it. It is a movie you made, a short film that you made in 2010 called Amy's in the Attic.
Oh yes.
Let's go ahead and first of all let's discuss the premise and any inspirations that may have come into making this film.
Yeah. So this was one of the reasons why I reached out to you before you watched the films, because I made the mistake once when we had the premiere of this, without telling people before they watched the film that this was meant to be an homage to Italian exploitation films. That it's supposed to look cheap. The cinematography is supposed to have that I Love Lucy style blocking.
Yeah.
No, that's all intentional. Because I think when I first showed the film, I think some people were trying to be very polite, but once I explained, so in this case, well, I mean, as I've explained many times, like I love Italian exploitation movies. Or horror films in general. And so this was an homage to a specific subgenre of Italian exploitation films, and that's called the roughie. And this is basically a setup where there's usually it can either be like a home invasion, like a film like House on the Edge of the Park, where two people invade the home. Like there's a party going on and two people invade and they sort of take over and make the people do degrading things. Or in the direction that I went in, the idea is that there's a bunch of socialites having a get together. Things are kind of not going according to plan. Things are a little dull, and so the ringleader decides to spice things up by playing a game where everyone puts their name in his hat, and whoever's name is picked has to be the slave. And of course, the film wouldn't be called Amy's in the Attic if Amy wasn't the person who was picked. So she goes on quite a journey. But yeah, I mean, this was very much right from the opening title card. That's sort of the idea that this, the original 35 millimeter materials are lost, and that the only way to watch this is through a mix of these, these distressed prints, some of which have Italian, some of which are in Italian with English subtitles. I mean, that's very much a tribute to, if you've ever purchased a DVD or a Blu-ray from Anchor Bay or Blue Underground, you'll inevitably, particularly a DVD of a European exploitation film, you'll inevitably see these warnings because, when these films were originally released in the States, they were cut. But now that they're uncut, they'll take scenes from like the Italian negative and splice them in to give you that uncut experience. So this was actually a lot of fun to conceive, because this was sort of the first time I was sort of doing an active homage to films and styles that I like. So I mean, I grabbed the Titanus logo that usually would appear before a lot of Italian horror films. We put that in here. I mean, we did the whole thing. I mean, the film was shot digitally, but we obviously put on the 35 millimeter filter to make it look like it was all filmic. And but I mean, Brian, let's be honest. I think there's one question that you want to really ask me about this film, and let me just jump right into it. there is something pretty controversial, and I'll be happy to talk about it. The choice of font that I used for the English subtitles was Times New Roman. Now, I'll admit that may have struck a chord with some folks. Usually, the typical font you would go for this would be Calibri Soft, maybe Helvetica. But Times New Roman, even I'll admit, you were asking me earlier what I regret for my film. It's got to be the font. It's a little too big. I mean, all right, so yeah. You mean the black?
Dare you use time? How dare you use that font? I can't believe you.
Oh, Brian,
you're an artist for crying out loud.
Oh, Brian, you're talking about the blackface. There's no need to beat around the bush about that.
Was going to come up.
You don't need to beat around the bush about that. I'm more than happy to talk about that. Truth be told, I must be honest, because up until now, you've kind of had me at a disadvantage because I wasn't really sure if you liked my films or not, specifically for these reasons. And so, I wasn't sure if we were going to do the talk after all, because, obviously you're entitled to feel whatever you want to feel. But, I wasn't necessarily looking for a contentious debate. But no, I'm more than happy to talk about all that. So there are two. Well, go ahead. I think we beat this joke.
Here's what I will say. Obviously, I personally didn't even think about the font, but now that you mention it, yes, it's completely offensive, and how dare you use it? No, I mean, so as I will say it's and first of all, I love the fact that it looks like it's derived from different prints and stuff like that. I love the fact that it looks like it was pieced together from different versions of it, and I love that idea, and I think that's one of the reasons that this film maintains such a strong vision is because of the fact that it's very much in that exploitation vein, and I really appreciate that, and I really got good I really got a good kick out of it. Here's what I will say about the blackface. Okay, I will simply say this is first of all, it's a big holy shit moment to notice. When it comes on screen, it's oh my god. But the fact of the matter is, it's when you put into perspective that this is basically about 5 people who are together, and one of their friends is intended to be a slave, and they can do whatever they want with them, and you know what? These people clearly have no moral compass whatsoever. And because of that, they don't have any reservations about putting somebody in blackface. And yes, of course it is offensive. Yes, of course it is offensive. But at the same time, it's a shock moment. And it was a moment where I'm oh, holy shit. But at the same time, did I think it necessarily added anything to the movie? No, but at the same time, I understand that it's simply for shock value. It's simply for, and these people have no moral compass whatsoever in this particular case. So it's you know what? We're gonna do whatever we want. We want to put her in blackface. We're gonna put her in blackface. We're gonna humiliate her like that, and that's kind of how. And that's basically what I wanted to say as far as the blackface.
No, and that's fine, because obviously that's something, and there's a lot. We can. There's a lot I like to talk about this film because there's a lot of controversy that would surround it later on. But no, in regards to the blackface, there's 2 answers that I can give you to that question. There's the short answer, which for all intents and purposes is the real answer, and then there's sort of the long-winded answer for people who don't buy the short answer. So the short answer to this is, in addition to being inspired by Italian exploitation films, there is one film, there's a scene in a film that very much inspired this whole picture, including the blackface. And there's a horror film called Last House on Dead End Street. Now you might be you'd be forgiven if you confuse that for Last House on the Left,
Yeah.
because this was obviously a film that capitalized on that. It's a film made by Roger Watkins in 1973. It's actually on Tubi if anyone wants to check this out, so you could sort of get the reference. The film's about an ex-con who basically wants to get back at the people who did him wrong, and so he decides to do that by filming snuff films. But anyway, so that's the premise of the film. But at some point in the movie, there's this party scene where there's a bunch of, not unlike Amy's in the Attic, there's a bunch of, but the thing is, like, these people are probably like the most, like, these are so not the people you would see at a party like this. These are like, like sort of like college types, like liberal arts majors and such. So they're all at this party. And there's a woman who is getting ready upstairs. Like, she puts her face in, she puts blackface on her face, and then she kind of comes downstairs. And like, whatever you might think of what we did in this film, this pales in comparison to the original, because like there's a whole thing where there's like a 7-year-old kid who's carrying a bull rope on a pillow that you would normally put like a wedding ring on, and then he hands this to a hunchback who basically whips the woman in blackface for about 10 minutes while everyone laughs. And it was a scene that stuck with me. And again, if you get a chance, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a good movie, but I mean, it's a fascinating story. I mean, even that, because originally that was a 3-hour film called The Cuckoo Clocks of Death, or Cuckoo Clocks of Hell, and then it got edited down to 70 minutes. But so basically the short answer, again, being that this was basically an homage to that film. The long-winded answer, okay, so it's been a while since I've given this speech, so let me just, the long-winded answer to this, and again, there's some truth in this as well. I've always felt that there were 2 ways you could make a movie. You can either take the art approach or the ideology approach. And right now, I mean, in film, one of my problems with a lot of modern day films is that ideology has trumped art, that people are making films about ideas and they're not telling stories anymore. And, there's, I mean, I suppose there's pros and cons to both sides. I mean, I feel people who are driven by ideology, will contort everything in their story to prove their ideology right. Whereas people who, let's say, are just focusing on a story, I've always found that approach much more interesting because as I'm writing a story, ideas kind of come to me and I'm like, oh, well, this is what this is really about. And this is kind of something I sort of reflected on after the fact. Like when I was writing Amy's in the Attic, I did a lot of research on Italian horror films. And I'm not sure if you were aware of this, but in a lot of these films, you would see live on-camera animal killings, particularly like in Cannibal Holocaust. That's the most notorious of these films, like where you see like someone has like this big large tortoise and they cut the head off and like it's all done on camera. It's really disgusting. And like when I was watching a lot of these films, I kind of realized that as much as I may admire them on a technical and aesthetic level, they're kind of deplorable, morally speaking. They're made by some of the most morally irresponsible filmmakers ever.
Yeah.
And at the time, I mean, even if I wasn't a vegan, but at the time I was a vegan, so obviously I wasn't going to kill animals on screen as part of my tribute to European exploitation films. But I mean, I do feel that if you are going to pay homage, if you are going to do like a Grindhouse film, you can't do a Grindhouse film with the perspective of a 21st century filmmaker. Like you have to put yourself in the shoes. And so, I mean, that's the long-winded answer as to why that's there. I mean, truth be told, if there's anything I really regret from that film, because one of the things I kind of pride myself on all my films is how they kind of have a timeless quality. Like, unless you read the end credits, you can't really tell they're from their respective eras. So the one thing that kind of really gives Amy's in the Attic away is the line that Barbara says after Amy comes in with the blackface, and she says, "Oh, finally, change we can believe in."
Oh, wow.
So for me, that's like, that kind of, but although even then, I will say that in some of the films that have inspired this, like House on the Edge of the Park, there is a black character that one of the villains likes to call Roots,
Oh
because
my
so I mean, in some respects, like I'm not trying to justify it, but at the same
Yeah.
time, like if this were made in the '70s and Obama was the president, they would probably do something similar too. So.
Well,
I've always told people, like, I'm not racist. I own the first season of Sister Sister on DVD. So, but anyway, but still, as you can probably imagine, when this sort of took on a life of its own, because we did have our big premiere at the Rialto Theater here in Montreal, and that's essentially the equivalent of like a Carnegie Hall. Like, it's a huge, huge theater. It's and the thing is, like, the story behind the premiere of this film was that there was an event called Grindhouse Wednesdays, and they would show like a feature, but then they would also show like a local short before the feature. And so I got a call from them. They were like, "Oh yeah, we want to show your film Amy's in the Attic." And I was like, "Oh, that's great. Do you want to do it at the Rialto? That's amazing." And I was like, "Oh, when do you want to do it?" And they were like, "Well, we're showing Coffee for Black History Month, and we thought we'd show your film before that."
oh wow.
So, in retrospect,
Wow.
at the time, like, I was upset with people for complaining, but now I'm like, no, I'm more upset with the people who organized this event, because they kind of hung me out to dry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because, like, when they first told me
That's
that, I kind of laughed and I thought, oh, ha ha, very funny. When you're really going to show this movie? And they're like, oh no, we're showing this for Black History Month. So,
yeah.
yeah. So, that. And, I mean, like, in retrospect, would I have done something different? At the time, the, I'm going to say something that I think every filmmaker who's serious about their career will say. And it's not going to be something that people are going to want to hear. And it's not something I'm very proud to say myself. But when you're young and you're starting out, and someone comes up to you and says, like, let's say in your case, because you're a musician, right? Like, if you lived in New York and someone told you, you want to play Carnegie Hall, who are you to say no to that?
Exactly. It's a
You know what
once
I
in a
mean?
lifetime opportunity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I was put in a situation where it's like, and I mean, the reason why there was some controversy was because, like, because the event was also sponsored by I think Head and Hands, which is like an outreach program here in Montreal. And I think where this all started, because they apparently got like a letter from someone who said that they watched this movie at a private screening, which struck me as odd, because I don't know who would have saw this, but they basically said that they would never support that charity if they go through with the screening. So that's kind of what got this whole thing going. And I mean, the screening was kind of awkward because they did a Q&A, and, like, obviously, everyone's question.
Yeah.
I mean, some people had like real questions, but then of course you always had that one person who was like, "Oh, are you a racist?" And as if even a racist would say yes. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, like, so that's kind of something that bothered me, because like I was kind of put in a situation where, like I certainly would never have programmed this on Black History Month, but
Oh God, no. Yeah. No, I mean, and the thing is, it's like this is basically, this is very much more in the exploitation vein. I mean, this is, I wouldn't even consider, like, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even consider programming something like this with, Coffee. I mean, I would, you would do something like the Italian exploitation films that you're clearly paying homage to. And yeah, I mean, that's a completely untenable situation. But yeah, I mean, I will say, it's far, going back to what you were talking about as far as ideology versus art. I mean, I will say, I mean, I do think that if you're putting ideology front and center, I mean, unless your film craft is just immaculate, and you're landing all of the emotional beats and all of that right, you're not going to make a great film because
Yeah.
because of the fact that it's too obvious. And I mean,
Exactly.
I think that's where that is where focusing now. I mean, granted, you have people like Spike Lee who very much can put ideology ahead of, but they also are brilliant craftsmen, and to where it's like when Spike Lee combines his craft and his ideology, it's a blunt weapon, and it's effective as a blunt weapon because that's the filmmaker that he's defined himself to be over the year.
I was thinking about this the other day. It's kind of funny how we sometimes get what we want. Because I seem to remember a time a long time ago, like growing up in the 90s, kind of lamenting over the fact that if you wanted to watch a movie about something, about an idea, like you would have to watch an Oliver Stone or a Michael Moore movie. And now it seems like it's the opposite, where almost every movie is like an Oliver Stone or a Michael Moore film, and like the idea of telling stories seems to be a bit of a lost art. I mean, in the case of Spike Lee, I really admire him, and I think one of the reasons why I do is because his films are very entertaining.
Yeah.
Like he does find a way to sort of like, I mean, there's no doubt that, his movies are about ideas, and I'm not opposed to films that are about ideas. I mean, like, my films have ideas in them too, but
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I think it's the approach you go by. Like, I still think that at the end of the day, most people who watch, like in my case, genre films aren't necessarily going there to be preached to.
Oh no,
So I feel like,
absolutely.
so I feel like,
Absolutely.
and so in some respects, that's sort of why I moved away from pure genre, just because I felt like I was having to do too many interviews. I mean, I love doing this interview, but I was having to explain to too many people, like, no, this is what it's all about, and you can't always do that. So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, so yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, it was funny because like now it's kind of like the opposite, and now I'm finding myself longing for the days when there was maybe a bit more of a balance.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, anyway.
Well, one thing that I do find interesting in Amy's in the Attic, I mean, obviously it's in the title, but your other three films, there's and we talked about with the Manipulator and the Subservient. I mean, one of the things I kind of got the impression of is that the male is very much in a subservient position in terms of the hierarchy, in terms of male female dynamics, and then in Vampiros Lesbos it's kind of the same thing. And then obviously in Eroticide we see what happened. We see Yan humiliated by his ex-lover, by Kendra, in the film, and then but in Amy's in the Attic, it's a female who is on that end of the humiliation. Was it basically just in terms of was it just in the inspiration of that paying homage to that particular genre that led to that switch, or was there something else that you were thinking about?
Well, I didn't get a chance to mention this because it just occurred to me now. But the thing is, when I was exploring, because I've always been really interested in gender studies and sexual appropriation, and when I was making, I guess you could even see this a bit with Vampiros Lesbos, but you really saw it with She Was Asking for It. That whether or not you're into S&M, the idea of a woman asserting herself, there's something sensual about that. And so I was interested in how, like, when I was filming the scenes in which the two women were raping the guy, I wanted to film that very sensually, very sexy, because there is something sexy about that, and something dangerous too. And then when we flipped the roles, when the man would get the revenge on the women, even though he was very much entitled to his revenge, the very idea of male on female violence carries a certain connotation regardless of the circumstances. So I was interested in playing around with that. I mean, as far as Amy's in the Attic goes, I mean, part of it was because it was an homage. I mean, part of it is because, let's face it, I mean, women in those types of roles are much more sympathetic. And the idea here was to feel sympathy for Amy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's kind of interesting because, I mean, you wouldn't have known this because I never really, I think this was before we knew each other. But after Amy's in the Attic was done, SV Bell, the guy who found my masters, he loved the film, and he was like, you should turn this into a feature film one day. And then I just wrote to him casually, well, if you are you willing to put up a budget? I'll turn this into a feature. And then he wrote me back and said, how much would I want? And no one ever asked me how much money I would ever want for a movie. And so that was sort of the next thing that came after Amy's in the Attic, was basically the feature version of the film that answered a lot of the questions that were left hanging after the short. I collaborated on that for about 3 months with a writer here in Montreal, Anthony Calabresi. And, we watched the short countless times, trying to find all those unanswered questions, like, all these leads that could eventually be explored in a feature. And what we came up with was a 165-page script.
Oh my word.
And basically, the film was structured kind of like The Godfather Part 2, where basically, there were two stories going on. There was the aftermath of the party, which was sort of done in the style of a giallo, a whodunit. There's basically like all the people who were at the party that night were getting killed one by one,
Mm-hmm.
and part of the fun was trying to figure out who the killer was. The other part of the story took place before the party, where we got to learn who Amy was. And the story that we came up with Amy is that Amy was a nurse working in a cancer ward. And one day she's going in to check in on one of her patients, and the patient starts losing his mind when he sees her. And the reason he does that is because he tells her that she looks so much like her mom. And she never knew her mom, so she goes home and she talks to her dad about this. And her father essentially gives her the story that he met her mother at this club called Cleopatra's, and and then he developed a relationship with his mother, with her mother, who was like a stripper who danced there. And then one night he came in and he found a baby that was left in his care, and he decided to name her Amy, and he raised her as his own. And so when she learns the truth about her background, she goes to this club, the Cleopatra's, to try and find out more information about her mom. And she meets a guy named Alucard. And, one thing leads to another, and they sleep with each other. But then the next morning, Amy tells Alucard her story about the mother who used to be a dancer here and the baby. And then basically, Amy never finds this out, but we sort of learned that Alucard was Amy's father, like her real father, her biological father. And so essentially, the reason why he held this party was basically to sort of get revenge on the daughter for sort of misleading him.
Oh wow.
So that was the feature. And
and there's a little bit of Old Boy in there too. Yeah. There's obviously a little bit of Old Boy in there too.
And then of course, we had the scene like in the short film, although it was shaped a little differently.
Yeah.
So basically, you had these two stories kind of converging on this scene of the night of the party. And so I was really proud of that script. We had a chalkboard, we had the whole story blocked out and everything. There was like dozens and dozens of characters, there were extras and everything. And for the longest time, eventually, we submitted the script to SV Bell, and he liked it. He obviously had some concerns. And then, for the longest time, and I'll admit this, for the longest time, I always thought that because the official reason why that project fell through was because the financing, there was an issue with financing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the official story. I always maintained that the real reason the film didn't work out was because he read the script. Like, he probably saw my film. He was thinking, well, maybe they'll just need a few thousand to add to this.
Yeah.
But then he saw like there was this new script with all these people. But having reconnected with SV Bell recently, with my masters, he told me some behind the scenes stuff that I won't repeat here. But let's just say that I was right about the financial thing being the real reason. Because
and plus, a 2.5-hour Italian exploitation homage that's structured after akin to Godfather 2. I mean, who wouldn't want to watch that? I mean,
actually, the thing is, in all fairness, like, this feature wasn't really going to have like all those effects and stuff. Like, this was actually. We basically took a Grindhouse film and kind of turned it into a real movie, like a drama. But and one thing too, we actually worked the title into a line of dialogue.
Oh wow!
So so it was. I think like there's a scene where, I don't know, like this is the end. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe one day this will turn into a feature. Maybe someone will listen to this and be enticed to want to finance it. But
that would be fascinating to see that story that you just outlined in on screen. It would be fascinating. No, I mean it's like this one. I think part of it is because of the fact that it's like I think. Because so much of it is in the exploitation vein and so much of it is more in that genre of filmmaking, an emotional connection to the characters is harder to make, I think, with such a simple storyline, with such a simple idea as a storyline. So I think that's the reason why it's like, of these three, it's probably not as much my favorite. And it's like, there's some stuff here that's pretty shocking, to be sure, but at the same time it's like, I think, especially because of the fact that now that I've seen the Franco's film, I don't know that I would have had as much appreciation for Vampiros Lesbos if I had not seen Franco's film first and we had not discussed that one first. And I think, even though you see it and you see maybe I should have pulled back a little bit more on the clear David Lynch influence, I actually think that I actually like the leaning into the Lynchian aspects of this, of the manipulator and the subservient, I think is as much of a reason why that movie lands emotionally as it does. And it's like, I do actually, I enjoy Amy's in the Act for what it is. It's like, but at the same time, it's like, of your films, it's not necessarily one that I'm not sure that I would go back to revisit anytime soon.
That's a fair enough assessment. That's fine. I mean, in all fairness, I mean, it's interesting though, because like I said, I did watch all four of these, and like there, it's quite a jump from Amy's in the Attic to Eroticide.
Yeah.
But in all fairness, like like if and when I make more movies, I feel like they would probably be more in the vein of an Eroticide than they would in the earlier stuff. I kind of feel like similar to the reason why I don't know if I would ever make another, nothing against Mario at all, but I mean, like, I don't know if I would make another still image film, is that I sort of, like, I'm a big fan of British comedy, like the BBC and everything, and one thing I really admire that is their ability to go out on top, like to not, milk something. Like they'll kill the characters of a popular series, like at the end of the first season. So like, I mean, so they clearly, they want to, keep the quality there. So in my case, I honestly feel like if I don't necessarily believe in going backwards. Like
Yeah.
I like to learn from the past and apply it to the future. But I do think that there is something to be said about people who just focus on the past and
Well, yeah,
their other films.
and that's the thing. I mean, I'm much more interested in a filmmaker that is moving forward and shows an evolution in their filmmaking style than somebody who just is kind of stuck in the past. And it's like, I think that's, it's like, look, it's admirable that at 91 years of old, Clint Eastwood is continuing to make movies. That being said, the last few Clint Eastwood movies I've seen are not even remotely as good as his best work. And it's like you feel like to a certain extent he's stilted any growth he's made as a filmmaker and is just kind of running in the same place because of the fact that that's what he's comfortable with. And then you look at somebody like Spielberg and you look at somebody like Scorsese, whom even after they've made all-time classics are still find ways to push themselves into different directions, into bolder directions in terms of storytelling, in terms of visual style, even in something as conventional as like The Departed, because that they're going to have something, they're going to try to, when they get a chance to do something like Silence or Tintin in the case of Spielberg, they're going to be challenging themselves as much as the audience that grew up with their films.
Yeah, and I've always admired filmmakers who are able to bounce from genre to genre while still maintaining that signature style. Because you're right. Because it does become very easy for filmmakers to kind of find a style and stick to it. Like if I wanted to, I could still have been making those still images films to this day. I mean, they were, I don't want to say easy, but I mean, compared to, let's say, a motion picture, they were relatively quicker to make than those. But then, I mean, you would just be going back to the well every time. And sometimes it's good to go back to the well, like when Kevin Smith did Clerks 2. But otherwise, sometimes it's good to move on.
Yeah, definitely. So when, looking at eroticide, I mean, we won't spend too much time with it because of the fact that we spent plenty of time with it in our initial interview. Looking at eroticide in the perspective of these previous three films, what is one of the things that, is there anything that surprises you about it in that context, or is there something that really stands out to you in the perspective of like looking back at your earlier work and then seeing this movie? And if so, what is it?
Well, I mean, certainly, I think the one thing that really jumped out at me was how I could sort of track the development, not only as a filmmaker, but as a human being. Like I mentioned before, like had I made The Manipulator and The Subservient in 2013, I have a feeling it would resemble eroticide more than, let's say, my other films. So in that respect, I can certainly see a growth. It's interesting because when you go from, it's almost like an art house sandwich. Like you've got The Manipulator and eroticide, which are kind of similar in theme and certainly in terms of being dramas. And then you've got like Vampiros and Amy's in the Attic, which are these sort of exploitation shock films that are very much different in tone from eroticide. But no, honestly, what I see is I see myself slowly becoming me, the person that I am today when I watch these films. It also kind of helps that I'm in them, so I could like physically see how I've grown. I mean, like when I must say, when I was looking at pictures of me in those booty shorts in Vampiros Lesbos, I found myself longing for the days when I had that body, because I put on a few pounds since then. No, I mean, like, but obviously, like, I'm proud of all of my films. But if I had to just show one, I would show Eroticide.
Hmm.
Obviously, I mean, that's the film that, I mean, from a behind the scenes perspective, that was my first real film in the sense that I had a crew of 20 people, everyone doing individual tasks. So I wasn't like wearing all the hats that I did in my other films.
Yeah.
And then, from an acting standpoint, I got to work with three of the best actors I've ever collaborated with. We did rehearsals, which is something you don't always get to do on indie films. We got to
Hmm.
rehearse on location, which influenced the way we shot the film. Like, for example, that long dolly shot, or that tracking shot from the elevator when it goes down the hallway, that was something we came up with on the spot because we had all this time to rehearse. I mean, I would have never thought of that alone in my office trying to come up with a shot list. I mean, this is just something we did because, I mean, so many things worked about that movie, and then of course, the success that it kind of went on to have afterwards kind of speaks for itself. I mean, it played in 25 countries, and I always say that, but no one presses me on that. So maybe I should just press myself. When I say it played in 25 countries, what I mean is that I guess I still have an agent, but I have an agent named, he's in Germany named, wait, what's his name? He works at Trom Kino. Oh, Andy Gross. Andy Gross. So he's a film programmer at Film Kino in Trom Kino, I mean, in Kiel, Germany. And so every year he has like a fetish film festival, and obviously he's shown my films in the past. But then with Eroticide, what he did is that he took my film and two other shorts, and he basically booked four-wall screenings in movie theaters around the world.
Hmm.
And so my film played in 25 countries in different movie theaters. And what he would do, because he would go there and promote the films and talk, and he would get feedback from people. So I have feedback, from all types of people all over the world in different languages, which doesn't really help me, obviously, but the English ones do. And so, yeah, so no, I mean, being able to see, like, I mean, so many people have come out and told me stories about their own toxic relationships and like how Eroticide in some cases encouraged them to get out of relationships.
Hmm.
And then, of course, you have people who, again, like with the fetish community, I feel like, again, with the fetish, and I say this from experience because I'm in there. So, I feel like with the fetish community and with a lot of communities like this, you have like I would say 2/3 of the people just want to be accepted or at the very least tolerated.
Hmm.
And then you've got that militant faction who wants to have their rights, who want to fight to have their rights, and they want to have their cake and eat it too. And the fact of the really matter is, there's a lot of really bad stuff that goes on in the fetish community. I have a story about there's a social media site that they have called FetLife, which is their Facebook. And I'll never forget, like, I was on there and my wife was on there, and someone sent my wife a message threatening to rape her. And she took a screenshot of that and sent that to the admins who run FetLife, and they basically told her to F off.
Wow.
So there's a lot of very bad stuff that goes on. I mean, the whole thing. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about Eroticide is, and it really put a lot of things into perspective because I don't know if I ever really told the story about Eroticide. I mean, officially, I've always told people that this wasn't really based on any one person, but rather the type of person I was drawn to at the time. But you know what? That's actually not true. It is based on a particular person. She's a filmmaker here in Montreal, and it's a really long story. Essentially, we initially met. I was giving a lecture for a film class that she was a part of, and after the lecture, she came up to me and said, "If you ever want someone to collaborate with you, give me a call." And then a couple of years passed. This was in 2008, and I was part of a play at the Fantasia Film Festival. It was called Infection. Basically, it was a story about a group of actors trying to put on a show, but someone gets bitten by a zombie, and that was me. And all kinds of havoc ensues. But anyway, so I was cast in that, and so was she. And we kind of got to talking, and eventually we went out one time, and we really hit it off. And then we sort of developed this, which in retrospect was a very toxic relationship. And, looking back on it now, especially with what I understand about at least how my brain works, in many respects, I really didn't know what I was consenting to at all. And that's the thing about, particularly humiliation, is that unlike flogging, where you can physically see when you've gone too far, you don't know when you've gone too far with someone when it comes to these games. I certainly didn't know how far I was going. And so this went on for I would say a good 2 years or so. Towards the end, we kind of drifted apart. I started seeing some other folks, and then eventually I met my wife, and the rest is history. But interestingly enough, last year something happened that I never thought would ever happen. So this is a bit of another tangent, but I actually have a few stalkers, but there was one stalker in particular who started posting everywhere that I would post saying that I had killed myself. And among the many people he reached out to, or she, or whoever this person was in fact the person who eroticide was based on. And so imagine that awkward conversation when I had to send her an email and ask her, hey, do you think you could delete this comment? But then something happened, and when she wrote me back, which was a surprise because I didn't think she'd even write me back, she said, "Oh, that's terrible, and I'll take it down." And then one thing she said that I never anticipated was she apologized for everything that went on back then, and that changed things for me. Because up until that point, it's easy to sort of hate or resent, or it's easy to forget about someone when you dehumanize them, when you don't see them as a person anymore. Like I was so blinded by everything that happened that, I didn't necessarily see some of the good that was there. Because while our relationship unquestionably had that toxic element, there were a lot of positive things too. And so when she apologized, that sort of humanized her in my eyes, and that made me see things a little differently than I had when I had made eroticide. And it's funny because I actually had an idea for a film, which I mistakenly pitched to her, and you'll see why this was a mistake. I had an idea to do a sequel to Eroticide set 10 years later, but in the real world, where basically I would be playing myself and she'd be playing her. And basically we would learn that we were the sources for the characters, Yan and Kendra. And basically the film was going to be us having a conversation about our past and trying to find some closure. The whole point was about closure. And so obviously, I don't know, maybe I was just, nostalgia I find is one of the most insidious things in the world, especially when you're lonely, because, at the time I thought, well, I'll pitch this to her and who knows, we'll see what happens. But she kind of, I think she realized that wasn't going to be a good idea. So that project kind of fell through. But we kind of traded emails back and forth, talking a bit about the past. And, I think at one point, I think I was just so overcome with emotion because so many things were kind of coming back to me that I pretty much told her that, the time that I spent with her was kind of like a golden age in the sense that, I was at the top of my game making films. I was in a relationship with someone who I saw as a muse, someone who inspired me. And in many respects, that level, that in many respects, I don't think, I've always found myself kind of chasing that time in my period, that period of time in my life. Even though like I've gone on to do, I guess bigger and better things, or certainly bigger things. If I'm really going to be honest with myself, I mean, that was a time in my life that was very special. And I told her that, I'm not sure why I told her that, but I just felt like I needed to get that off my chest. And sure enough, like she wrote back, and I could tell that she was quite moved. And then we agreed to meet up with each other, and we did that, and that lasted about a good hour and a half before I ended up having a panic attack and had to leave. Just because, well, I'm not going to go into all the personal stuff, but anyway, it's just, so anyway, I mean, I guess the reason why I brought that up was because with the manipulator and the subservient, I eventually met up with the person it was based on, and we watched the film together. Unfortunately, with Eroticide, we didn't really get a chance to do that. Although I do know that she watched the film. I'm not sure what her opinion of it was, although I can't imagine that she liked it. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, I don't know, like we tried to organize a second meeting just to kind of tie things up, but unfortunately, I'm not sure. Maybe I woefully misread her intentions, but at any rate, this is a sort of little postscript to Eroticide, because I did eventually, in some respects, Eroticide almost kind of came true.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier on in this interview discussion, it's a combination of the two, I think, is that you are prepping and you've worked on writing another film, and I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a little story before it, though. If you'll indulge me. I only told one person this, and I feel like I'm confident enough to talk about this. So this year has been really, really tough on me for a lot of reasons. Health-wise, let's just say I've seen more sunsets than I'm going to see. And then, personally, there are a few decisions that I'm gonna have to make that are pretty painful, and I'll have to cross that bridge once we get there. But this was a really intense year, and for some reason, like, I stopped taking my medication, which really didn't help at all, because that just exasperated my symptoms. Mm-hmm. And I fell into probably the darkest depression, certainly since the time that I was let go at the Carlton. And the other thing too was that, all year, whether it was, whether I was like meditating or just in dreams, this date would keep showing up in my head: 9/22, 9/22, 9/22, and I couldn't really make heads or tails about that. But I did know one thing, that I was basically going to take my life, and I figured, well, 9/22 is as good a day as any to do that. I live in Montreal, and where I'm located, there's a big overpass overlooking a big highway, and there's a lot of chain fence material that essentially prevents people from, doing what I'm about to describe to you. And what I would do, like, every day, or whenever I would pass by that, like, I would have like these sort of pliers that I would keep on myself. And whenever I would pass by that overpass, I would cut a tiny piece of the chain link fence. And I would do that every time I would pass by that fence. And that was supposed to symbolize the fact that, on 9/22, I was going to essentially take the plunge and take my life. Then something happened on 9/14. The man that I would consider a personal hero, and certainly one of the greatest, if not the greatest, stand-up comedians of all time, Norm Macdonald, passed away. And he was a huge inspiration for me, because that's another thing that I didn't mention, that one of my dreams was also to become a stand-up comedian. And so naturally, and I find like he and I have few parallels in our careers. I mean, obviously, I never worked on Saturday Night Live, but I had my little hot period, and then when I disappeared, and so he passed away, and he left a huge body of work. And the great thing about some of his material is how cinematic it is. Like when he's telling this joke, you can picture it in your head. And there's one joke that he has told, and I don't want to say it because that's going to give away the film. But I will say that there's a joke that he's told on his podcast about a man who visits an isolated house where there's only two women who live there. And that's all I could really say because so much of it is based on the punchline. But essentially what I'm going to do is take one of those jokes and adapt it. And, it's not going to be a long film, but it is going to be a way for me to get my feet wet again and work with new people. And then based on how that goes, perhaps that might lead into bigger and more ambitious projects. But for the time being, that is going to be the plan. My plan is to adapt one of Norm Macdonald's jokes. It's going to be my first adaptation. So it was very interesting adapting that into script form. It's funny because some people were reading the script and they pointed out a couple of plot holes. But when I told them that this is based on a joke, I'm sure even Norm Macdonald, bless his heart, wasn't thinking of all the whether the story made sense. So, like in an effort to stay true to the material, like everything is going to be there, plot holes and all.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if all goes according to plan, hopefully we'll shoot this in the fall, and I don't know, maybe it'll be ready by the end of the year. We'll see. But I'm very happy that I have. Well, first of all, I'm happy that I'm still alive. And that I have renewed purpose. But I'm also happy that I'm also happy to be back making films again because this is going to sound sad, but I've told so many sad stories. But if you were to ask me what I was more proud of, my work as a filmmaker or that of a film programmer, until recently, I might have told you my work as a film programmer. And the reason for that being because, by going up and doing introductions and in some cases doing like little acting sketches, this was kind of like theater. And I always really enjoyed theater because the response was immediate. And you could tell you could tell like when people are into you or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also just proud of all the connections I had made and friends who would come to the event and are starting to do their own events now. But I never told this story, but at one point I had deleted my Facebook. This was after Carlton. And then about maybe a few months later, I created a new account and got back online. And, I never deluded myself for a second that there would be, pages and groups dedicated to the memory of the Carlton Midnight Society. But I certainly thought that there might be one or two people who might have wondered, what happened to the Midnight Society. So imagine my shock when there was nothing whatsoever online about what happened to that crazy bearded guy at the Carlton who did those Midnight Society events. And that kind of broke my heart, but it also humbled me quite a bit. Maybe I needed that because now, of course, that doesn't take into consideration anyone who might have called the cinema, but let's be honest, I'm never going back to the Carlton. So the only way I could know what's going on is what people are posting.
Yeah.
But I can't really say that about my films. Granted, every once in a while I'll get an email from someone saying that they, played a solo on the Devil's Clarinet while watching my movie, and thanks for that. But then of course I would also get people who have really nice things to say, things about how your films have shaped my sexuality. I'm never entirely sure how to respond to that, but
yeah.
Thank you. I was just thank you. But then also, I've gotten nice comments about the films themselves, and of course, your comments today. So if I'm going to be honest, I think I'm far, far more proud of my work as a filmmaker because I know that people know my films and care about them. And yeah.
And I will simply say, and again, thank you very much for your honesty. I know, like I said earlier, I know that type of thing is very difficult to talk about, especially in a public setting, even though it's initially recorded as just a conversation between you and I. And it's tough to talk about. And I will say that I think you have a lot to be proud of when it comes to your films, and I've known Arouside. I mean, Arouside has been one of my favorite discoveries of filmmakers sending me their work since I first saw it, and that still holds true. And now that I've seen your other work, I mean, it definitely shows me the storyteller that you were right out of the gate, and it shows me the growth as a filmmaker as well as an individual over the years. And I think that's one of the things that is I think that's one of the most important things that art can do. I mean, especially, I look at my, I'm certainly somebody that if you listen to my early pieces, you can tell they're rough. You can tell they're somebody just trying to come up with their voice and figure out what their voice is. And then as the years go on, as this ideas get more and more dense, and as the ideas get more and more complicated, you can definitely tell that there's a voice is being established. And it's like, there are still pieces of mine that I made early on that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. There are also some that I'm like, oh yeah, I would never do something like that now. And but it's all part of the continuum. It's all part of the journey. And I think it also shows and I look at those pieces, even though I feel like my work as a critic and a podcaster and a discusser of film is ultimately my personal legacy. It's like the idea of somebody listening to my music and going, oh, I really like that piece. And it's like, I really enjoyed those ideas you were exploring. It's like, that's something that it's meaningful when you get that type of praise and when you get those type of words. And I'm very grateful that we were able to have this discussion.
Oh, as am I. Thank you very much for having me on the show and thinking me still culturally relevant.
And once again, where can people find your films?
Well, they can find them on my YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/Matthew Saliba. And I'm pretty active on there, so feel free to send me a message. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in addition to the films, there's other stuff that I've done at the Carlton too, but go for the films.
Yeah. But yeah, Matthew, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Brian.
I'd like to thank Matthew for joining me on the podcast today. I'm really grateful to be able to talk to him about his work, and it's really diverse and worthwhile movies to listen to watch. And I hope you take a chance to watch his work on YouTube. That's going to be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Got a lot of great things coming up in the end of the year, and I hope you are ready for that at www.sonic-cinema.com. Thank you very much.